Let's then consider the intellectual context in which he wrote this book, and it becomes apparent if you read particularly the first part of the book. Let's just take a look at the very first word of the text. What's the first word of the text? Nature. The very first word he put down on paper in writing this book is nature. That's a very interesting word to start with. Who does that bring to mind? Of the people that we have read so far, who would you associate the word nature with? Aristotle. Nature, if you remember, is the foundation of Aristotle's entire political project. Because you remember that at the beginning of the Politics, in that first book, what does he say? That all communities aim towards a good, and the state is the greatest good of all, right? So the first thing he establishes is the state linked to then this idea of creating the greatest good. And why is the state the greatest good? What's the basic principle of that? Because all people are political by their nature. And so in order for us to exercise who we are as nature made us, it inclines us to form political societies. Therefore, if we're able to form political societies, it is the vehicle by which we can achieve the greatest good. That's the Aristotelian imperative. So when we see Hobbes starting the text with the word nature, right away it tells us that we are in, if you will, a familiar intellectual landscape, because we've already considered, as Hobbes himself, who was deeply versed in the classical literature, we have already seen an entire political scheme built up around the idea of man as a naturally political animal. And indeed, a lot of what Hobbes wants to tell us in this introduction is how his book offers a very distinct reading from the political imperative that is laid out in Aristotle. He says, nature, the art whereby God hath made and governs the world, is by the art of man, as in many other things, so in this also imitated, that it can make an artificial animal. So you'll note that the first word is nature, that which emerges naturally, and the last word of that sentence is what? An artificial life, which is the exact opposite of nature. So here we have the world of nature, that which exists naturally, and here we have the world of the non-natural, the unnatural, that which is created, that doesn't exist spontaneously out of nature. The entire journey of this text encapsulated in this very first sentence. To go from nature to beyond nature, from nature to artifice, from nature to something that must be constructed. This, of course, sets it in distinction to the idea of Aristotle. For Aristotle, politics is a reflection of our nature, and the challenge then is for us to align our political selves in ways that are fully in keeping with who we are as political animals by nature. And you may recall that for Aristotle, the ideal state, the best state to live in, is the state where the good citizen, and the citizen is created by politics, is the same as the good person. And the person is created by nature. And so therefore, the excellence of the state and the excellence of the individual, where those are the same, that's the best state, because in both those cases, your political society reflects then what is natural. Whereas here we have Hobbes telling us right from the beginning that we need to be thinking about the creation of what he calls an artificial animal, an artificial life. He says, art goes yet further, imitating that rational and most excellent work of nature, man. For by art is created that great Leviathan, called a commonwealth or state, in Latin, civitas, which is but an artificial man. Whereas for Aristotle, the state is a product of nature. For Hobbes, the state is a product of art, a product of artifice. It is not natural. It is something that we must construct. That's essentially the key idea here that we see in the very short introduction. This is not going to be a work of philosophy that's telling us that we need to align our political selves with our natural selves. Instead, it is going to be a work of political philosophy that explains how do we constitute meaningful sovereign authority outside of our nature, using what nature has given us, but what work must we do in order for us to achieve that end? And so, in this sense, what we find in Hobbes is essentially a contrast with the Aristotelian view, with that Aristotelian argument that politics should be seen as a reflection of the natural man, and that therefore we should aim to practice a politics that is consistent with our nature. If we go back to the historical circumstances of Hobbes' life, that's more than just a scholastic or intellectual dispute, because the institution of kingship that was terminated by Oliver Cromwell and the Roundheads, by the parliamentary forces during the English Civil War, when they reconstituted the English state not as a monarchy but as a republic, who of the great political authors up until that point provided a strong argument for building up a state ruled from the middle? Who said a state ruled from the middle is a state that best serves all of its constituents? Aristotle. Aristotle is the political theorist who lays out striking and compelling claims for essentially a type of republicanism that reflects the center, which is indeed what we would argue the parliamentary republicanism of Cromwell was trying to achieve. So from the point of view of Hobbes, it's not only that Aristotle's political philosophy is wrong because he misreads who we are by our nature. It's also dangerous because people have taken those ideas and used them to destabilize the politics that surrounds us. And so in this context, the Leviathan can be understood not only as a corrective to Aristotle, but as a plea for a better kind of politics that an Aristotelian political vision cannot provide. And I think in that plea, in that argument for a better kind of politics, there is a close alignment with Machiavelli, although the Hobbesian project is much more carefully worked out. But you may recall that in Machiavelli, the problem is that because people are fickle and disloyal and mutable and will be changing their opinions all the time, therefore you have to have a mode of power that's capable of overcoming all of the challenges that represents. And you may recall that when we talked about Machiavelli, the oppositions that captures that sense of instability driven by people themselves is what he calls virtu, the art of the ruler, versus fortuna, the unexpected. And I think for Hobbes, it's a similar kind of idea, which is that we want to be able to set up a system of sovereign authority that in the context of instability, driven by human nature itself, can nonetheless achieve a kind of stability. That's the net goal. How can we construct a stable form of politics? And we observed yesterday in our reading of Machiavelli, when I asked that question, does Machiavelli have a political theory? And I offered what may be a somewhat idiosyncratic reading of Machiavelli, but nonetheless is justified by at least parts of the text, that for Machiavelli what matters is what he calls preserving the state. That the art of rule is not self-aggrandizement or self-enrichment, but preserving the state, so that people may get on with the business that they want to do, that they may continue to grow their crops and engage in trade and the like. And that, I think, that idea of preserving the state is key to Hobbes's political project as well. The reason why kingship has to be reconstituted in this radical way is precisely because the previous model of kingship is not stable. And therefore we need to think through it in a different way to arrive at a more stable basis. In order to do that, we have to then ask some very basic questions. And in this way, there's sort of a sympathy with Aristotle, which is we have to go back to first principles. The layout of the text in this way shares some rapport, I think, with the Aristotelian idea, which is if you want to talk about political society, who do you have to talk about first? You have to talk about the people who make up political society. You have to inquire into human nature before you can then proceed to the question of how do you constitute sovereign authority. And that's why the entire first part of the entire first part of the work, the part one of the book, is devoted to an inquiry into the nature of man, how we acquire ideas, how we use our reason, the things that are around us, in other words, who we are. That's critical to this larger political project, because if we're going to reconstitute sovereign authority from the ground up, we have to then consider sovereignty at its most basic level. And at its most basic level, that simply refers to each individual. You are your own individual sovereign. From that, we can then proceed to build up a larger image of a sovereign state, of the Commonwealth, of the Leviathan. Now, students are not usually asked to read the first part. You're usually asked to read just the first part of part 2. But I have asked you to read the parts of the first part Not only to torture you, that's just a bonus, but also because it's exceedingly interesting what Hobbes does in this first part of the book. I've skipped the first 8 or so chapters, 9 chapters, in which he talks a little bit about how we acquire ideas and so on. And I've asked you to read chapters 10, 11, 12, and 13, in which he considers the questions of power, which he does of what's called of power, worth, dignity, honor, and worthiness, the question of manners, of how we behave, and then the question of religion. And then he ends the first part of book 1 by engaging in a radical thought experiment in which he imagines what does it look like if we can return ourselves to a pure state of nature. With that, he then terminates his consideration of who we are as human beings. What's very interesting there is the order in which those chapters follow. First, let's talk about honor and power and dignity and offices. Then let's talk about manners. What's another way of saying manners? Values. If we say someone is well-mannered, we're saying they're educated, they are civilized, right? So manners reflects our civilization. And religion, what does religion reflect? Our faith. Well, from this point of view, we are, if you're monotheistic, you are part of a revealed religion, right? So religion is the idea that we have embedded in our social system this deep truth. So we have the principle of power, honor, dignity, worth, and value. The principle of civilization, and then the religious constructs around us, chapters 10, 11, and 12. And then what's chapter 13? Man in a state of pure nature. Which, if you think about it, seems to be putting the cart before the horse. Shouldn't we talk about man in a state of nature first and then build out power, honors, all these other things? No. So the very ordering of the chapters tells us a little bit about what Hobbes is trying to achieve. And if you use your brain for a moment and you think about what that order suggests, it suggests that honor and civilization and religion are not actually fundamental elements of who we are. And so therefore they cannot serve as the basis for the inquiry that Hobbes wants to proceed with. Yes, question?
What do you mean by he wants universal sovereignty?
Universal sovereignty, meaning a sovereignty that everyone can agree upon. Just to be clear, because that is an important point, this was the point about the 30 Years' War. If I am a Protestant and my king is Catholic, do I recognize the sovereignty of my Catholic king? No, because I consider him to be a heretic. So the point is that model of sovereignty inherently invites instability because it's based on the nature of people's belief. So the question is, how do we then retrench back to first principles to derive a model of sovereignty that can invite universal agreement? So that even though you are a Protestant and I am a Catholic, nonetheless, here's a point of agreement that we both may share. Yeah.
So we'll say that he doesn't agree with the Western system.
With a what?
With the Westphalian,
with the Westphalian system.
Yeah.
No, I think what he took away from the Westphalian system is that the church, that ecclesiastical authority is subordinated to sovereign authority, which is an overturning of the medieval framework. As you learned in your class last semester, during the sort of period of medieval Christianitas, right, in the feudal system, that the church rises above temporal authority because the authority of God is greater than the authority of man in that sense. I mean, as we noted last time, in practice, it didn't often look that way. But the principle is that the church represents a greater form of authority than kingship, for instance. This is now a formalization of overturning or inverting that relationship, right? Now, I will say, actually, on that point, there are different ways of reading Hobbes. My reading of Hobbes will probably differ from those of others. I am fairly convinced that Hobbes was, by this time in his life, pretty, if not completely, atheistic. And the whole last part of the book, which is a sort of discussion of the Christian Commonwealth, I read that as Hobbes covering his tracks because so much of what he says would lend him to be accused of atheistic heresy. I mention it now because when we come to chapter 12 on religion, I think we can see pretty clearly that if he's not atheistic, he is at least agnostic or deistic. He doesn't clearly believe in the kind of constructed Christian God for all of the stuff that he says in Book 3. At least this is my view. Now, there are other scholars who don't agree with that, and I want to make that clear, that this is my reading. And when you write your own essays on Hobbes, feel free to provide your own reading. You should all become your own readers of these texts. That is the privilege of a class like this one. Yes?
But was it in view or to be an atheist?
You did not want to be an atheist in the 17th century. Yes, that was not a good thing to be. You know, you kept that pretty well hidden. It would have just been so contradictory to the whole thinking of how human affairs were ordered. And you certainly would not have wanted to write an entire book that embedded atheism as a sort of key principle in this way. And I should note that it's not even until the 19th century that we start to see people even advancing arguments that are even atheistic. We have to move through a form of deism before we get to non-deistic views. Yeah.
Did people at the time when he wrote the book, thought as you do, and so like tortured him?
Oh yes, he was widely condemned for heretical atheist thinking. So it's nothing new. This is the charge that's being launched against him, and he defended himself rigorously against those charges and denied it and so on. So my reading is inconsistent with Hobbes' own claims. On the other hand, you know, it's protesting because you have to, not because it's true. That's my reading, as I say. Let's start then with chapter 10, the power of a man. So we're starting with this question of power. What gives somebody power over others, power over their environment? Where does that come from? I'm going to argue that all of these, chapters 10, 11, and 12, together, really what they're trying to do is to dismantle an existing medieval, scholastic, Catholic or religious view of power, order, authority, and the individual subject within that. Hobbes wants us to strip away the artifice that's been created by hundreds of years worth of theology and politically inflected theology to instead come back to basic questions and think about who we are. In order to get there, therefore, we have to strip away all the stuff that we think we know about ourselves so that we can go back to first principles, hence the ordering of the chapters. Notice that what he says, natural power is the eminence of the faculties of the body. Instrumental are those which are acquired by these or by fortune, are means and instruments to acquire more. Power exists in two modes. There is a natural kind of power that attaches to you as a function of your natural talents. And then there is an artificial power. There is an instrumental power which are acquired by fortune. Who does that make us think of? Thank you. Are means and instruments to acquire more. So you cannot represent yourself as being a natural holder of power. That doesn't exist. Power exists both as a natural and as an artificial element. Remember, if you're trying to advance a claim of kingship based on divine right, what you're essentially saying is by virtue of your birth, you've been granted a mode of power that is distinct from that of others. In other words, it's a natural claim to power. Hobbes wants to tell us right at the beginning that power is itself natural and artificial. And we'll see then the greatest of human powers, so I got that here, is that which is compounded by the powers of most men united by consent. In other words, the powers that we have, if we can collectively aggregate them, that will then lend itself to the greatest power. That is a constructed power, right? An artificial power, a power that I have that I link with somebody else to create a combined power, which is therefore a construction. In one person, united by consent, in one person, natural or civil, that has the use of all their powers depending on his will, such as is the power of the commonwealth. In other words, it's making a claim right here at the beginning of a mode or a reading of power, a power that can be concentrated in one person, natural or civil, but that power itself is derived by consent of everybody pooling their power together. This is the model of power that we want to look for. Let's take a quick look at this just for reading it. Natural or civil. In one person, natural or civil. Do we all understand what that means? A natural person would be like, for example, a king. A civil person would be something like a national assembly. In other words, it's not an actual physical body, but it's a single entity that commands sovereign authority. So this is his idea of what power is. The ideal form of power, the ideal sovereign form of power is an artificial construct driven by consent that represents the aggregation of all individual power.